So my name is Wendell Pritchett, and I have the honor of serving as the provost of this amazing university. And on behalf of the university and as provost, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this kickoff event of the 2018 version of Faculty Teach-In. Now, kickoff event is a little odd because we actually already had several events, and they were well attended and very interesting. And I know this one will be an interesting event too. And we're really happy to have all of you here. So, what are we doing here? Why are we here? So, as an institution with a mission to create and disseminate knowledge, to illuminate and educate, Penn and other colleges and universities are at the forefront of the debate that we're having in this country right now about what we want to be as a society, right? And interestingly, I would say, unfortunately, a major part of that debate is about the fundamental question of what is knowledge for, and what is a university for? And that is why the faculty, under the leadership of its tri-chairs and under the leadership of this year's chair, Santos Venkatesh, thank you for your leadership. Yes. That is why the faculty of the Senate decided to organize this event, the first one in 50 years at the university. And so the teach-in, and I bet that several people in this room have already participated in some of the earlier events, but so you already know, the teach-in in the events and programs that we have planned for the week we're going to seek to take a fresh look at a question that once seemed self-evident. What is a university for, right? Now, we don't claim a patent on knowledge, right? Higher education plays an extremely important role in the creation of knowledge and the dissemination of knowledge, as we're going to talk about this evening, and in other places. But we do want to play a major role in the debate about how knowledge is formed and disseminated. So how can we and should we make the case for our relevance as institutions of higher education? How should we partner with communities to help us serve each other and help for our communities to understand the importance of education in the creation and dissemination of knowledge? So this is a really worthy event, and I'm going to quickly turn it over to the panels. We have an excellent panel here tonight. And so to introduce the panel, I'm really pleased to introduce to you Tracy Matisak, who's had a front row and sometimes with a microphone view of this big debate that we're having in our society right now about the role of knowledge. So for 12 years as a reporter and an anchor for Fox 29 in Philadelphia, and more recently as a contributor and a host on WHYY and NPR's Radio Times, Tracy is perfectly suited to lead this discussion. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to her and thank her for our participation.
Thank you so much, Wendell, and thank you all for being here. This is a really exciting week at Penn, and I have to tell you that it has been an absolute delight for me to get to know some of the people here at Penn, Dr. Venkatesh and our panelists. Really been a wonderful experience. There is a quote that is attributed to Ben Franklin, and it goes like this, of course, the founder of the University of Pennsylvania. The quote goes like this: "An investment in knowledge pays the best interest." And while there may be those who would argue that that's no longer true, the aim that we have here tonight is to affirm the value of knowledge and to explore its creation in the 21st century. We will also, during our panel discussion, explore the challenges in communicating knowledge and the role of the university in disseminating it. So, with that said, it is my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished panel for tonight. Professor John Jackson is the Dean of the School of Social Policy and Practice and the Richard Perry University Professor of Communication, Anthropology, and Africana Studies. His work is boundary-breaking, touching on technology and religious studies, culture and economics, anthropology, and new media. Professor Jackson is also a filmmaker and documentarian whose work has been screened worldwide and has received numerous awards. So please join me in welcoming Professor Jackson. And you'll hear from him in just a moment. Professor Sarah Tishkoff is the David and Lynn Silfen University Professor in Genetics and Biology. She holds appointments in the Perelman School of Medicine and the School of Arts and Sciences. Professor Tishkoff's work has taken her to rural Africa, where she has created the world's largest database of African diversity from genetic samples of more than 10,000 people across hundreds of different ethnic groups, with the aim of gaining a better understanding of causes and possible treatments of disease. And then we have, please join me in welcoming Professor Tishkoff. And Professor Dorothy Roberts is the George A. Weiss Professor of Law, Sociology, and Africana Studies, and the Raymond Pace and Sadie Tanner Mosel Alexander Professor of Civil Rights. That is quite a mouthful. She is also the founding director of the program on race, science, and society, and that program builds on her, you might say, head-turning critique of race-based genomic science and medicine, that race is a social and political invention and not a biological fact coded in DNA. Her research is fascinating. Please join me in welcoming Professor Dorothy Roberts. So before we get into our discussion, two things I'd like to mention. One is that you should have received an index card on your way in for questions. Is there anyone who did not receive an index card? Just raise your hand and we'll get one to you. Okay, I see somebody there. Those cards are for you to jot down questions for our panelists as you listen to them tell you a little bit about their work and listen to our panel discussion. We want to budget some time for your questions. So be sure to jot down your questions, and we've got some student assistants who will collect those from you 30 minutes in and 60 minutes in. So we would ask that perhaps you would pass your questions to the nearest aisle, and that will make it easier for our students to collect those and get them to our panelists. The second thing that I would like to do is to invite each of our panelists to share briefly with you something about the nature of their work and how it is that each of them goes about creating knowledge. I think you will agree that their work extends far beyond the classroom. And so once we are finished with that, we'll follow that with our panel discussion and then with your questions. So we'll begin with Professor Jackson.
Can you not hear me back there? Okay, so I'm going to try to project. I feel like I need to move around. I have 10 minutes. I got a lot of ground I want to cover. Right? But let me just say very quickly, I would organize my remarks today by simply saying that I am, for better or for worse, and a lot of times I think genuinely it is for worse, an anthropologist by trade. And when I talk to people about what anthropology entails, like what its basic fundamental question is, I usually will frame that by saying, in my opinion, it's a discipline that's both the most humble and the most hubris-filled in the academy. Right? So it's hubris-filled, I would argue, because there isn't really another field, not even physics, not philosophy, that can imagine card-carrying members to be in the humanities, in the social sciences, and the natural sciences. It's cutting across all of those fields, and doing it in ways that are often housed in the self-same department. But I also feel like there's a version of what drew me to anthropology as a way to try to understand the world that's linked to its more humble instantiation. It's more, I think, humble and interestingly intimate form of knowledge production. And that's this idea that anthropologists want to imagine that any human being, any entity, is a powerful ambassador for its cultural universe. Doesn't matter what it is, it can be a version of high culture or low. It can be a prince or a pauper. No matter who it is, if you listen carefully enough, if you respect their perspective, if you try to understand where they're coming from, they can tell you something incredibly profound about the world they exist in. That's the premise of anthropology. And it says you're not a respecter of status or difference. What drives you is the single solitary question of what makes human beings human. That's it. Now, the answer to that question can be vexing, can be disputed. We're going to actually have different versions of what that answer is. But why I thought anthropology was a nice place to begin a conversation for myself as someone interested potentially in the academy was because it allowed me to tackle three different things that I thought were important to me. So I'm going to give you those sense of those three things and then sit down. So that's it. So clearly, one issue that you're going to hear a lot about today is the question of race. What is race as a way to organize communities, as a way to think about our species? When I was a graduate student, I would argue I was being told two very different and maybe irreconcilable things at the same time in anthropology. So the anthropology of race was organized around this idea that if you could just disabuse people of their misconceptions about the biological or genetic or physical mores of their notions of race, if you could prove to them it was bad biology, then you could disabuse them of some of the more dastardly kinds of social actions done under the auspices of investments in racial purity. That was the idea. Convince them it's not biological in the way 19th century scientists imagined it was. Show them that it really is a version of culture masquerading as biology. Clearly there are biophysical differences, but they don't, and the folks on the panel can tell you, and I think much more intricate and elaborate and sophisticated detail about how and why that is. But race itself isn't a very valuable and accurate proxy of how to think about what those biophysical differences mean. So that was, and a lot of our kind of analytical eggs were put in that basket. Prove to people that race isn't biologically real. There's still to this day a traveling exhibit that the American Anthropological Association sponsors that goes all around the country simply with this idea of saying, let's explain to people why race isn't biology. I think it's a powerful intervention. But at the very same time, we're being told something that I think is slightly different from that. It was the idea that culture, right, one of the things that cultural anthropologists thinks helps to define what makes us different from other species on this planet. The idea of culture can have productive force all on its own. Right? That what it does in the world is sui generis. It's not reducible to whether or not it has biological mores at all. That culture can have an impact that's simply based on the logic of cultural landscapes. You have to figure that logic out on its own. It's not the same as biology. It doesn't, if you prove it's culture, it doesn't mean we don't engage it. Part of what we recognize as a cultural anthropologist is all the stuff that we care about, that we fight over, that we're willing to die for, that's the stuff of culture. That's what it is, at least from an anthropological perspective. So we were being told culture has its own force, it has its own value, we have to understand it on its own terms, and it does stuff in the world. But we're also being told we can convince people that race is not biology but culture, somehow will inoculate them from some of the more pernicious ways in which we deploy it. And part of what I've been trying to think about as an anthropologist is, yes, if we win the argument that race isn't biology, if we can get that right, if we can prove to people that all the reasons why they feel very comfortable with the notion of race being a proxy for something that's biologically real, what's left then to do to explain to people what we use these categories, what we deploy them, what we mobilize them to get out of the world? What's left? So if you get the social constructionist stuff right, even if you get it really right, what's left for you to analyze? And one of the examples, and I won't belabor this point, that I bring up often is this guy named Leo Felton, who in 1999 got arrested in the Dunkin' Donuts in Boston, Massachusetts for passing off fake bills. I found out about it because it made the headline of, maybe it was the Tribune, I can't remember what the newspaper was at first where I saw it, where when they found him, they realized that part of what he was doing when he was trying to pass off these fake bills was trying to find a way to bankroll this elaborate neo-Nazi skinhead operation that was trying to fund the blowing up of monuments, Jewish monuments all around the area. So they foiled this plot. But that wasn't even what made it interesting to an anthropologist of race. What made it interesting to me was once the journalists got a hold of the story, they realized that Leo Felton actually wasn't white from southern Italy, which is what he was pretending to be among his neo-Nazi compatriots. He was a love child, quote unquote, in the 1960s, black bus driver father, white mother, and he was passing for white among the neo-Nazis. Now, when the journalists approached him about why he would do this, it wasn't because he was doing an expose for the New Yorker or the Atlantic, or none of that. He was there, he argued, and he was passing doing the work he was doing because he recognized that all of his compatriots were what he called racial materialists. He thought race was on the body. Right? They thought race was on the body, in the body, in genetics. But he recognized, and he could quote anthropologists and philosophers, he recognized that race wasn't biological. And his investment in it, he argued, wasn't about it being some kind of biological reality in the 19th century sense. So in a way, he got the memo about race not being biologically real, but he could still deploy it to do the most heinous, or attempt the most heinous action he could attempt under its auspices. For me, that's a quintessentially anthropological question. Right? How can he do it if he's already been convinced of the fact that it's not biological? We can do it because still as cultural force, as a cultural product, it can have a control, it can have an impact on the decisions we make that can be just as potent, right? So Leo Phelps, to me, is an example of how and why there's still something left over to study, even after you recognize that we've won the argument for the most part about race not being biologically real. We still don't know what people do with this really contorted and complicated cultural category that we all accept so easily. And the thing I want to stress is race isn't the only thing that is biologically real. All of the categories we use are cultural categories. We still hold on to them for dear life. We still use them to do some incredibly, sometimes dangerous and deadly things. So anthropology of race is one thing. The second thing I'll bring up is the anthropology of religion. I'll be very brief about this. For a whole bunch of reasons, anthropologists, from time immemorial, as it were, have cut their teeth on the study of religion and religiosity. Right? One of the things we know is it seems to be that the brain is almost wired for religious commitment. So the anthropological project is one that says, what kind of cultural practice is religion? And that's a dangerous question to ask, because already, for a lot of religious traditions, that sounds and feels blasphemous, right? Because you're taking something that isn't merely simply cultural, and you're trying to reduce it to the same terrain as the secular, right? But there's a version of this question, this idea of how and why we're committed to these questions about sentient beings above and beyond ourselves that help us navigate this complicated and seemingly inescapably bizarre world that for an anthropologist is really the sweet spot of what we have to figure out. One, because we seemingly all do it, but all do it very differently. And the commitments we have to these things are some of the strongest we have, period, in the world. Right? So anthropology of religion is the second thing. It's connected to race for me, especially because I look at how African Americans deploy this notion of spirituality or religiosity across the globe in interesting and sometimes newfound ways. And the third and final thing, I'll sit down on this note, is the anthropology of media. So when I started as a PhD student at Columbia, I chose anthropology. I didn't really know all the other stuff I just told you about anthropology. I was a filmmaker as an undergraduate. And I chose anthropology because I thought it was a field that could accommodate filmmaking, because there's a long tradition of anthropologists using media technology, especially film, to do the anthropological work. So I thought, wow, I can have my cake and eat it a little bit. But one thing I found as soon as I got to graduate school, from the first second I got there, even though I only got in because they had hired, unbeknownst to me, an anthropologist of media from the University of Chicago who was set to start at Columbia the semester I was going to start. So we had a fit. If they hadn't hired that person, I wouldn't have got here. Who knows where? I tell people now, I would have probably made Black Panther. But instead of going to LA, I went to LA. And so I got there, but within a week, it was clear to me that they would have been comfortable, my advisors, with me picking up a film camera again once I got tenure somewhere. Between that first week of graduate school and tenure, I was to write exclusively. And that's what I told them I was doing. But I wasn't hard. So, and this is when film was still film. Right now we say film, it's really digital video, but we were still like changing magazines in a black bag and sending it to a lab and hoping the exposure was right, and editing linearly on a steam bag, all that. But part of what, for me, was very powerful about that moment is I continued to make movies, but I had to do it all under the cover of darkness. Why? Because, in a way, part of what I recognize is for my colleagues who were very light, my advisor was fantastic, it wouldn't have counted as scholarship. Right? That's not what we do as academicians. And so I only came out to my advisor once I was on my postdoc safely with my degree on the wall and showed her all the films I was making. But I bring that up now because one of the things that I'll sit on this note that I'm proudest of in my now 12 plus years at the University of Pennsylvania is one of my PhD students here became the first student in the history of the University of Pennsylvania to graduate with an all-film dissertation. It had never happened for 27 plus years. And that there are dozens of people coming behind her. And it isn't a trivial fact, and I'll sit down on this note, that this was a first-generation student of color from Washington Heights who would not have come to Penn unless I told her we get this done, and we did. So I think there are all these other implications of our definitions of what knowledge is, how we constitute it, and then who we imagine can be a part of the conversation about how we produce and produce it better.
All right. Well, maybe I can skip using that. Can you all hear me as well? Yeah. So it is truly an honor to be here as part of this historic event. And one of the things you're going to see that a different way that we disseminate knowledge in the biological sciences is we love to use slides. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. Someone's going to put on the slides.
Should work. Just click forward twice. Just click forward.
Oh, quick. Oh, sorry. Yeah, see, and I should understand the basic technology here. All right. So, actually, like Dr. Jackson, I actually had a background in anthropology at UC Berkeley, where we had this four-field approach. At UC Berkeley at the time, Dr. Alan Wilson was the founder of molecular anthropology. It was really the first time they were using molecular tools to address the same exact question: what is it that makes us human? Now, prior to that time, let's say, the past 30 or so years, people were using fossil data, paleological data, to reconstruct the origins of humans since our divergence from our closest relative, the chimpanzees, thought that we diverged sometime in the past 5 or 6 million years ago. So these red dots represent the locations of anatomically modern fossils of anatomically modern humans. We know that the earliest evidence for modern humans was in Africa, and very recently, in the past year, there was a study that pushed the state back to about 300,000 years ago. There's also evidence of early modern behavior. So this is one of the earliest examples from a cave in South Africa dated to over 100,000 years ago. And it's actually an artist's toolkit where they found remnants of pigments that were used to perhaps either for some kind of body decorations or for cave paintings. And then through an integration of genetic data and archaeological data, this is where we get this map from, showing that after the origin of modern humans a few 100,000 years ago in Africa, relatively small numbers, we think it could have been in the hundreds, for example, of people migrated out of Africa, giving rise to all other populations around the globe. And that's really shaped the pattern of genetic variation that we see today. Another really exciting finding, this has really only been in the last, 6 years or so. Again, integrating, in this case, paleobiology and genetics, getting ancient DNA from fossils of, say, Neanderthals who existed in Europe and the Middle East and diverged from humans at least 500,000 or so years ago. We know that when modern humans migrated out of Africa, they not only ran into these archaic populations, but they interbred with them. And now somewhere between about 2 to 4% of the genome of non-Africans descends from these populations. Now, I want to talk about genomics. So let me just start by showing you, these are the 22 pairs of chromosomes that we get from mom and dad that make up our nuclear genome together with the sex chromosome. So if you're a male, you have an XY, and if you're a female, you have 2 X's. So the genome is a sequence of letters at the most simple. A, G, C, G, and T, we refer to these as nucleotides. And like English letters, the particular sequence matters. So BAT isn't the same as TAB, and ACT isn't the same as TCA. Our genome consists of 3 billion of these letters strung together. And they're wrapped up very tightly into these chromosomes. But if you unwound them, they would, and tied them end to end, they would wrap the distance between the Earth and the Moon 50 times over. So these 3 billion letters in the genome specify information about how our cells work to make tissues, how tissues work to make organs, and how organs make us, us. So think of the genome like an instruction book for bodies, but the problem is the book's written in a language for which we only know a small number of words, a little bit of punctuation, and some sentences here and there. So genomics is about learning to read this book. Now, we're talking about generation of knowledge. So this is how we used to generate genetic data back in 1980. Really slow, difficult, with a lot of radioactive material. Okay, so we could only get about 600 letters per year. Let's fast forward to 2018. This is the latest next generation sequencing machine. I think it's called NovaSeq. It just came out from Illumina. They can sequence 1 human genome per hour. It's remarkable. So what's happening now is we're generating this massive amount of data and information, but the problem we have is we don't know how to interpret it. We still don't know exactly how to analyze it and to figure it out. That's what, where we need to improve at the moment. So what have we learned by looking at genomic diversity? Well, if we look at identical twins, in theory there should be 0 differences. If we compared any genomes in this room, it should differ in about 1 out of 1,000 of these nucleotides. Human chimp, 1 out of 100. Human mouse, 1 out of 30. Human broccoli, 2 out of 3. So, given 3 DNA bases, that's about 3 million differences between any pair of genomes. This is, I call it, a funny slide of Estee Lauder's version of the ethnic diversity amongst beautiful people. Amongst the rest of us, there's really very little divergence at the genome level. We're talking less than 0.1%, reflecting this recent common ancestry. Now, when I started my research, it's clear that Africa is key for understanding human origins, also for understanding genetic and environmental factors influencing disease that's common in people of African descent. But when I started this research, there was very little known about African genetics, a major bias towards Eurasians, and that's still true today. So myself and my lab, my African collaborators have been doing field work for the last 18 years or so, and I just wanted to show you a little bit of what it's like. So we study minority populations who practice indigenous lifestyles. They live in very remote areas. We have to bring this four-wheel drive vehicle with us and bring all of our supplies, and I like this because it shows you the outside and the inside perspective. This is from Tanzania. These 2 individuals here are members of the Hadza hunter-gatherer tribe. So they're one of the few human populations that continues to practice traditional hunting and gathering lifestyle. This is our anthropometric setup for measuring like height and weight. This is me returning results to the community, something that's extremely important. And in fact, we spent a huge amount of time in community discussion, talking about why we're doing this research, what are the potential risks, what are the potential benefits, and ultimately getting individual informed consent. And when that happens, we've been collecting blood. From that, we're isolating DNA. We're also getting detailed ethnographic information. And then we have this challenge of how do you process this in an area where there's typically no electricity. So when I first did this, we had to hook up the centrifuge to the car battery, but now there's a generator. It's kind of out of the picture here. We can set up a lab in the bush, basically. So I'm going to briefly now tell you what we've learned. This is actually a study we did a while ago, but it remains the largest study of genomic variation in ethnically diverse Africans, looking at over 2,500 Africans from 121 populations shown here, and a comparative set of non-Africans. Now, so part of what my lab does is field work, then we do data generation, and then we do computational analysis to make inferences about past events. So one of the methods that we're using is to try to figure out individual ancestry. So these different colors represent computationally inferred ancestral populations. And this is composed of a bunch of lines. Each line represents a person. So for example, in blue here are people who self-identify as European or Middle Eastern. Here are people from India, from Pakistan. You can see a lot of admixture, right, in that region. East Asia, Oceania, and the Americas. And you can see from all the colors in Africa how much genetic diversity there is in that region compared to the rest of the globe. So in fact, if we just do this again in Africa, and here I pulled individuals together and showed the proportion of ancestry as a pie chart, you can see the remarkable diversity in Africa. There's no such thing as a representative African individual, and it really disputes any notion of an African race, because we're seeing more variation among these populations than we are amongst sometimes global populations. There's also a lot of variation in certain variable traits. People, you can see they look different. There's some different traits that are due to adaptations to different environments. And I'm going to end by talking about a recent study that we published about an adaptive trait, which is skin color, and it'll also be relevant because it's something that people often use to define race. And it's really a terrible classifier of race for a number of reasons. But what I'm showing you here is inferred melanin levels. Melanin is the pigment that causes skin to be more darkly pigmented. And what we can see is that the darkest skin colors are in people from sub-Saharan Africa, but also Australo-Melanesia and South India. And this correlates with UV exposure, so it's thought this is an adaptive trait. And the idea is that when our ancestors left Africa, went to higher latitudes, there's less UV, and there'd be selection for lighter skin, because UV is actually really important for generating vitamin D. This is something that is synthesized through a reaction actually in the skin. And if you don't have vitamin D, there could be really negative consequences. But in places with a lot of UV, there'd be selection for darker skin to prevent skin cancer, and also to prevent degradation of folate, which is really important for development of the fetus. Now, until we did this study, almost every study to date had been on European populations. So we wanted to learn about the genetics of skin color in Africa. So we went into the field, and what we do is we use a spectrophotometer, which we shine light either under the arm, so that's reflecting that's a place where it's not going to see a lot of sunlight. And you can also contrast it to looking at the wrist if you wanted to look at tanning, for example. And you look at the wavelength of the reflectance, and from that you can infer the melanin levels. We find that the most lightly pigmented population in Africa, interestingly, are the San, who until recently were traditional hunters and gatherers from southern Africa. They also have the oldest genetic lineages in the world. Then we see a lot of ranges of skin color, and the most darkly pigmented people in the world are people originating from South Sudan, who speak Nilo-Saharan languages and traditionally are pastoralist populations. So I think, again, you talk about generating new knowledge. A lot of people didn't realize how much variation there was for skin color in Africa, almost as much as we see on a global level. We then looked at 4 million variable sites around the genome in about 1,600 people, and we identified 8 new sites in 4 regions of the genome. Many of these were completely novel and never been identified before. What I'm showing you here is we then looked at these sites and we said, is the ancestral, or let's just say, is the ancestral state the light allele, so the variant associated with dark skin, or the variant associated with light skin? And in half the cases, the ancestral variant was the one associated with light skin. Furthermore, when we estimate the age of these variants, almost all of them are older than the origin of modern humans. So this really resulted in a paradigm shift in what we thought about the origins of skin color. Now, if we look at this poor chimp who has an autoimmune disorder and lost all its body hair, you can see he's relatively light-skinned. This is thought to have been the ancestral state or skin color. When our ancestors in the genus Homo habilis, for example, about 2.8 million years ago, left the forest, went into the savanna, there would have been selective pressure for more sweat glands for thermal regulation and for losing the body hair. And then there would have been selection for darker skin. But people, when you see like drawings that people make of these populations of Homo erectus or Homo habilis, they always make them with really, really dark skin. And I think our study shows that both these variants for light and dark skin have been in Africa for a long time. They could have had moderately pigmented skin. It could have been variable in different parts of Africa. So just lastly, I'll end with this question I always get asked: are humans still evolving? The answer is yes. And of course, thank many people who contributed and funding organizations. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. It's a real honor and pleasure. It's fun to be part of this teach-in and get to be part of the kickoff event for it. So I heard this morning on WHYY someone talking about the teach-in. I didn't catch who it was, but he said that what it's really about is, it was about how do we solve problems. That knowledge creation is to solve problems, and we disseminate our knowledge and we circulate it and want to have an impact in order to solve a problem. And so that made me think about what problems am I trying to solve in my work? Why do I produce knowledge? And the problem that I work on is the problem of social inequality. I'm especially interested in how race, class, and gender inequality intersect, especially to produce suffering and disadvantage among Black women and how they resist that. So I'm interested in why it is that Black women were prosecuted for using drugs during pregnancy, creating a crime out of public interest, a public health problem in the late 1980s. Why did it turn out just recently, a study found that the U.S. maternal mortality rate, the rate of women dying from pregnancy-related causes, is actually going up in this country? And why is it that Black women are 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than white women in America? Why is it that Black girls are more likely to be suspended in school for the same kinds of offenses committed by other girls? And for me, the question is, what in our structures in society cause that? So John mentioned biology, and Sarah talked about genetics. Culture has come up as well. My focus is on the structural reasons, the systemic reasons, the institutions, especially legal institutions. As a legal scholar, but I also look at social stratification as a sociologist and combine those forms of knowledge creation to solve this problem. I've become especially interested in the relationship between biology and society in explanations for the reason for this problem of social inequality. And one way, very typical way, that's lasted a long time for the explanation of social inequality is that biological differences between groups produces their social inequality in society. And increasingly, we are doing research that looks at how social inequality produces biological differences. These are 2 very different ways of thinking about how social inequality gets produced in society, and increasingly we're trying to understand the relationship between these 2 different perspectives. Another way of looking at it is the perspective that bodily differences produce social inequality, like the claims made in the bell curve, where Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein claimed that class inequality in the United States was produced by genetic differences in intelligence, compared to another view that just had a headline recently in the New York Times, "We're sick of racism," literally, that structural racism is what produces racial gaps in health. So it's the social inequality that produces the biological differences. Now, the idea that social inequality is produced by biology is actually rooted in something else that Dr. Jackson talked about, the biological concept of race. Because the biological concept of race holds that the reason for differences that we see in society between people identified as belonging to different races is naturally created. Race is a biological, natural division of human beings, and therefore the inequities that we see are produced by those biological differences. In fact, the very reason why race was invented was in order to explain away the inequalities produced by a group that enslaved other people and treated them as chattel property. The explanation of European typologists was that was created because Europeans were at the top of a chain of being or hierarchy, a natural hierarchy produced by nature, and Africans were at the bottom, and that their traits reflected these natural differences. And so slavery wasn't a horror produced by political inequality. It was simply the result of a natural division which the scientists claimed was created by nature. So race and the biological concept of race has always had a political meaning and a political origin, a political reason for existing. We thought that that concept of race was completely discredited. Been discredited for decades, but it seemed as if the mapping of the human genome finally put a nail in the coffin of the biological concept of race. And indeed, organizations like the American Sociological Association, the American Anthropological Association, construct, not a biological reality. But in fact, what happened after the mapping of the human genome is that we saw a resurgence of interest in genetic differences between races, with many, many, many studies being conducted, both trying to find race in the structure of human populations and also looking for genetic explanations for differences in health related to race. So this idea did not go away at all. In fact, it's seen a resurgence in many scientific studies being conducted in the United States and around the world today. In addition, race continues to be treated as a biological category in medical practice. And the racial concept of disease, which came out of slavery, the idea that people of different races have peculiar diseases and experience common diseases differently, that idea promoted largely by Samuel Cartwright, who was trained right here at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, and he promoted the idea as a justification for slavery, that black people had lower lung capacity and therefore needed to be forced to work in order to be healthy. That he also helped to develop an instrument called a spirometer that corrects for race. It measures lung capacity and it includes the assumption that black people have lower lung capacity. Well, that device is still used in many hospitals around the country, and some versions of it have a button for race that still corrects for the assumed lower lung capacity of black people. I could give you lots and lots of examples of medical technologies today that include the assumption that people of different races have bodies that function differently. And one of the examples of this very recently was the Food and Drug Administration's approval of the first race-specific drug, a heart failure therapy that was patented and approved for labeling for black patients in particular. Another aspect of biological explanations of social inequality that have been the focus of my research is the way in which black women's childbearing has been treated as a social problem in the United States from centuries ago to the current day, and how this assumption that the reason for black people's disadvantage is that black women are having too many babies. It gets incorporated into media, into stereotypes, and into policy. So the black welfare queen, who was supposed to have children just to get a welfare check and then waste it on herself, that image was so powerful in the United States that it helped fuel the abolition of welfare as an entitlement. And we can see Congress referring not explicitly to these stereotypes, but in coded language, the idea that the reason for poverty, persistent poverty in the U.S. was because of welfare dependency, especially by women who just used welfare to cheat taxpayers in order to spend money recklessly on themselves. So I have worked at Penn to create an interdisciplinary program, the Program on Race, Science, and Society, that addresses both the conflict between disciplines about this question of the role of biology and social inequality, and also to call for more engagement. So this program is dedicated to bringing together scientists and scholars, researchers from multiple different disciplines, from both the biological and the social sciences and the humanities, to come up with innovative ways of thinking about human diversity and unity and structural problems without relying on the biological concept of race, and intervening in what some people present as a disciplinary battle between biologists and sociologists. How can we come together, both sides agreeing that race is not a biological category, but also trying to figure out this complicated relationship between biology and society and how social inequalities can produce biological effects, taking into account structural inequalities and not leaving them out of the research design. Because despite advances that we made in getting rid of the biological concept of race, looking at how race is a social construction, there is still a big gap in understanding how structural inequities affect biology and affect persistent social gaps in welfare. I have disseminated this knowledge through books on these topics, on the legacy of the devaluation of Black women's childbearing, on how race affects children in the child welfare system, and on this resurgence of biological concepts of race in genomic science and biomedicine and pharmaceuticals. And I also find it important to reach out to a broader public, not only through my books and speaking, but also through Twitter. And I have almost 12,000 followers, which is okay. And also a TED Talk that has been viewed by more than a million people. Also, trying to use this work to influence policy and education, especially by bringing together people from different disciplines. And one example is an article I co-authored with others with Sarah Tishkoff, calling on human geneticists to take race out of the field of human genetics and stop relying on biological concepts of race in their research. This got a lot of attention and helped to spur NIH to have a working group meeting on this that Sarah and I both attended. Another example is my work with a physician and researcher, Jonathan Metzel, on addressing how medical students can be trained to be structurally competent, not culturally competent, which often means they're taught stereotypes about people's culture, but to understand how structural inequality affects their patients' health and what to do about it, and we're hoping to have an impact on changing medical education in this country. And finally, I have always found it essential to work with people in terms of producing my knowledge, but sharing it and making it useful to people who are advocating for change. And so I participate as a board member on a number of boards and engage in social activism along with them as I understand how to solve these problems and how to make an impact. And that's me, by the way, at the March for Women's Lives in 2004 as a member of the board of the Black Women's Health and Care. So I'm there and look forward to it.
By the way, the final exam will be next Tuesday, so I hope everyone is paying attention and taking notes. You didn't come to a teach-in and think that you wouldn't be taught, I hope. All right, so panelists, let's begin here. We have convened this panel to talk about the importance of knowledge. Its creation, its communication, its role within the university. Benjamin Franklin thought of knowledge as a power for good that would help morally inspired, scientifically oriented people develop and implement practical solutions to strategic problems affecting human well-being. So I'd like to begin by asking each of you to share briefly with us how you think about knowledge and its role in the 21st century.
So I guess I would start by saying part of what I would emphasize is, and some of this is clearly a function of being dean of a school that imagines it places a premium on thinking about the link between concepts, theories, and practical solutions to the world problems, is that ultimately, I think a version of what we're all saying in different ways, and that I think is foundational to understanding what knowledge is, both now and in the past, is a version of what we're doing here that's really about storytelling. right? It's about saying like, but it's storytelling on many different levels. So one level is, what is the story we tell about what we imagine we see in the world, right? So it's one thing to talk. So even the idea, to go back to Dorothy's example, of thinking about lung capacity as a justification for physical exploitation is a leap, right? That's a storytelling flight of fancy.
Right.
But ultimately, I think part of what we have to recognize is we produce knowledge that is a reflection of what we believe, what we think, how we think the world should be, what we prioritize in it. So being sort of self-critical about our own investments and our own priorities helps to explain some of the things we prioritize and maybe the other things that we don't take as seriously as we should.
Okay, Sarah?
So I guess wearing my geneticist hat, to me, it's sort of integrative, small changes building upon prior work, say, that other scientists have done. And so we're typically, based on prior research, we're building and testing hypotheses. So we will then generate data and test these hypotheses using statistical approaches. The word I was looking for incremental, very incremental changes. And that's one thing I think people don't always recognize, some will, but in science, the changes are very, very slow and incremental. Every so often, we find something totally new and we all get super excited. But most of the time, it's not like that. And the other thing I would say for me, knowledge is being able to integrate across multiple sources and to think critically.
Okay. Dorothy?
Yeah, I think that knowledge is influenced by and helps to produce a way of thinking about the world. And so social assumptions can affect our very design of research and how we interpret the results. Race, for example, can shape the way people actually see the world, and it can shape the way in which they interpret the meaning of the results of research. And that's so true today, where research has found that people come to scientific research with preconceptions, and that affects how they interpret what the findings are. But I think it's important to remember that it also affects the research designs and the interpretations of the scientists themselves. So how do we work with this without just saying, oh, well, we each have, his or her own worldview, so it doesn't matter. And for me, and this is influenced by something that James Baldwin said, and I'm not going to try to quote him verbatim, but he talked about ways of thinking that either bring us closer to reality or away from reality. And I like to think of knowledge as a way of understanding reality and bringing us closer to reality. That's how I like to judge whether knowledge is useful or not.
Okay, thank you. And you mentioned some challenges just within the answer to that question. Sarah, I'd like to ask you about the unique challenges that you face as you go about creating knowledge. I mean, you mentioned in your presentation just the lack of electricity for starters, but tell us a little bit more about some of the challenges in creating and communicating knowledge.
Right. Well, the challenges, working in Africa has its own set of challenges, no doubt about that. And just, as I was saying, to me, the biggest challenge right now is developing better computational statistical approaches to interpret that huge amount of genomic data and trying to deal with the computational power we need. It's a huge limitation. So that for me is a real challenge. In terms of communicating, that's something that is a major part of what I do. And that could be talking to reporters. For example, when that study came out about genetics of skin color, you see something that says genetics, skin color, Africa, and you have to be careful about how people are interpreting the results of the study. So I had to be extremely careful. It's my responsibility, I felt, that when I speak to the media, to take my time with them to make sure they understand and to correct any misperceptions. Now, at the same time, I can't control what other people will do with that information. Given the nature of my research, I've had both fan letters and hate letters from, white nationalists. So it really depends on how they're going to use that information.
Yeah. Either of The other you want to weigh in on that?
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, one of the issues for anyone interested in studying, well, I'll say two things. One of the issues important for anyone interested in studying culture is you recognize that there's no sort of Manichaean point outside of it from which you can look at it in some sort of objective sense. You're always studying from inside the belly of the beast, which is a different kind of practice. And so it means recognizing that no matter what you do, you're kind of caught up and implicated in the project. And so you have to be mindful of it, but it can't stop you from trying to know more, right? And trying to think more critically and deeply. The other important thing I think I would stress is whether it's natural sciences or social sciences, that stuff is also just the stuff of culture. Right? So it's not like scientists are magicians, right, who can just do hocus pocus. I mean, these are cultural actors, and it means their cultural worldviews impact the ways they understand the research, even the questions they begin at the outset to ask. And so I think there's a version of recognizing that doesn't mean you dismiss science out of hand, but you recognize that it doesn't have a special, I mean, what's special about it has a certain organizing principle, a logic for how you assume evidence, the ways in which you have to agree on a certain aspiration for objectivity, but it's still a cultural practice. And there are all these complicated ways in which we have to come to terms with the fact that you can respect science's value for what it tells us about the world and not fetishize it as something outside of the cultural domain.
And Dorothy, your work necessarily requires you to challenge science sometimes with the goal of getting to better science, right?
Yeah, that's right. A whole lot of my work is trying to expose or help people understand how those kinds of assumptions that Dr. Jackson was just talking about that affect all scientists' work may shape the way in which they design their research and describe the reality that they're finding, and how to, in our society that where science is so politicized. So ironically, there's a way in which liberals are supposed to not criticize science because that's what the right wing does. And so therefore, sometimes when you criticize scientists, it's seen as being anti-science, when in fact, my critiques of science are in order to try to improve it, to make it more transparent, and to help scientists understand how their research designs themselves, the very way they frame what the research problem is affected by assumptions that may be rooted in unjust systems and ways of thinking. So while it's absolutely true that every scientist is affected by their culture and by what they were trained to believe or how they grew up, but we can identify certain ways of thinking that have caused harm to other human beings, and that to value the humanity of them, and that we can decide are unjust, and try to change scientific assumptions and designs and analyses so that they don't support and incorporate those unjust ways of thinking.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about technology, and John, I'll start with you on this question and its role in the creation and communication of knowledge. Certainly, I think we can all agree that the pace of technology is such that it's difficult to keep up with, and you could make the argument that people are being left behind in that. How do you think about that, and what are some ways that perhaps we might be able to shrink that knowledge gap that technology is creating just by virtue of its own pace?
So one of the things I think technology does, or at least one way you can look at it, is it in some ways makes the classic anthropological project obsolete. Right? So historically, anthropologists brought to, quote unquote, the modern world stories of folks who you would otherwise never be able to see, right? Cultural worlds you'll never experience and understand. With a click of a button, you're anywhere on the planet at any second, right? You don't necessarily need an anthropologist there to take you to those spaces, but I think part of what we're trying to recognize is how do we make sense of and organize this inundation we have of all this information. I think there's a role then for science to help curate some of that, to help get people to understand what they're seeing, to separate the wheat from the chaff, as it were, and to get them to hone their own skills as critical users and consumers and producers even of this new information, of this new media. And I think that's a version, I think, of what's on the horizon for the Academy more generally, is getting folks to recognize that it's not a luxury to imagine you're going to have a facility in multimodal research or multimodal scholarship. Because part of how we get our information now is already so overdetermined by the multimodal formats and platforms that we use. And so getting ourselves to think very carefully about how that then should probably change some version of what we assume we have to impart to students when they're here, and expect from faculty members who need to be a part of these public conversations in some productive way.
And Sarah, you and I were talking earlier about the fact that there's sort of this drinking out of a fire hose quality, because there is such a proliferation of information, and that maybe some of the problem is kind of sorting through all of it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think part of the problem that we have now is with, social media, and, people can be saying a lot of things. You're getting overloaded with information, and people have to be able to critically evaluate that. And I think that's a really important role that we have as faculty members, is teaching critical evaluation. And in fact, I was going to say that, one of the things that has changed recently in how we educate students is sort of flipping the classroom, because traditionally we come in and we just lecture, we sort of, particularly in science, it's very easy to just go up and give a bunch of facts. But now more and more people are trying to even sometimes pre-tape their lectures, have the students watch them in advance, and then you go into the classroom to discuss them or to do the problem solving, and the professor can offer guidance, but you want the students to also lead that as much as possible, to interact with each other, to help each other to do problem solving. So I think that's a new, it's a very critical skill that we're teaching students.
Yeah.
If I could just add to that, just one thought I have is in this discussion is that we shouldn't assume that more technology is necessarily good. Technology also is influenced by cultural and political and social assumptions and ways of thinking. And I think a very interesting aspect of research now is looking at how artificial intelligence and algorithms that allow various institutions to predict risk, for example, algorithms that allow the police to predict who is going to commit a crime, that those technologies themselves are embedded with the assumptions, the social assumptions of the people who created the algorithms. And so another example is gene editing, which is a remarkable advanced technology, but is it something for reproductive purposes that we want to promote in our society? That's a subject of great debate. And so the technology itself also should be the subject of critical evaluation.
But just expanding upon that,
Sure,
also,
go on.
I worry about us trying to inhibit the generation of knowledge for fear of how it will be used. So, for example, the gene editing, right? It can be used for some really unethical things, or it can be used for some really important things. Like there are now some gene therapies developed based on using CRISPR-Cas9 editing. This has also been a big issue, particularly in people who study scientists who study the genetics of behavioral traits. Should we be doing it? Should we not even, should we just not study it at all? Do we just not want to learn? Because, oh my gosh, what if we do find something, and what if we found there were differences in ethnic groups? How would you deal with that?
But so then, for me, the question is who gets to be part of that debate? And so to the extent I've been involved in this through an organization, I'm on the board of the Center for Genetics and Society, we are calling for more democratic participation in the people who are making these decisions, including, for example, people with disabilities or people who might have little access to these technologies, to be part of the debate about what would be a useful, just use and what wouldn't be. because I think you're absolutely right. We shouldn't say, oh, let's not find out, let's not do it at all, but what is the way to proceed and who should be involved in making that decision? How do we make that more democratic?
Yeah. I want to end with this question, and then I'll go to questions from our audience because we have a number of them, but we want to talk about not only the role of the university, but the responsibility of the university as it relates to creating and communicating knowledge, not just internally, but externally to the larger community. And I'd love for each of you to speak about that, and then we'll go to our audience questions.
I mean, I think increasingly it becomes clear, I think, to even academics who would have traditionally imagined that your job was to cordon yourself off from the world behind an ivory tower, that there is no space outside of the tumult that is the contemporary public conversation, and that you can't escape it. And your job, I think, and I think the job of a university in the 21st century is to be a very positive and ethically driven contributor to these larger conversations. I think one of the things that's at stake now is, are there honest brokers? Are there institutional spaces where folks can talk about this stuff in ways that aren't easily politicized or dismissed as partisan? And I think the university is being thrown into those debates as a partisan actor at this point, and trying to figure out a way to think about how to make sure people recognize the value to society writ large, the value to, no matter what the specific questions are that drive us as individuals, the value to our species of having the space to get people to think carefully and critically about honing their skills to ask and answer some of the most important questions that we have to face. And I think there's a version of that we can't give up, and we can't simply concede to the political landscape as just another sort of partisan, partial, and subjective actor in the larger political fray. And I think that's something that's important to try to hold on to and to argue very vociferously for.
Great point. Sarah?
Yes, I think, an important role that we have, in addition to generating knowledge, data, and publishing, for example, in scientific journals. That's one of my bread and butter, basically. But at the same time is communicating to the general public. And there's a number of ways that I do that personally, such as giving lectures to the general public. I've helped with museum exhibits. I've done podcasts. One of the most interesting yet intimidating things I did was Reddit, where people could ask me things, and then in real time I have to type them out quickly and answer them. But that was really fun to do. And then Twitter, I don't have nearly as many followers as you, but that was something that I just started doing recently. And it's also a place where I learn about all the latest research from Twitter. I personally learn a lot from my colleagues who will tweet about the latest research study, or did you see this talk? And they'll alert me to it, and then I'll go and look this up. So
Yeah, picking up on what Dr. Tishkoff said is the way in which it's a mutual relationship. It's not just that the university disseminates knowledge to the outside, but I found, and I suggested that in my opening remarks, that my engagement with public interest organizations, with activists, with other institutions, museums, and other institutions which may not be on campus, helps make my research better. It helps me understand the dimensions of the problem I'm looking at. It helps me even know that there is a problem for real in society, and it also helps me think about what would be effective ways of intervening. So for me, it's important for me to share the knowledge that I generate, but it's also important for me to learn from people outside the university to make my research better and more useful.
Okay. So with that, we'll go to our audience questions, and this is for any of you. It says, non-discrimination statements, including Penn's, seem to always list color separately from race. At best, that seems to acknowledge that skin color does not equal race, but I wonder if the panel shares my hunch that that listing of color is very odd alongside race, gender, and the like. What do you think?
So color, so just say the last part of it, that the listing of color,
The listing of color
as well
is odd
as race
alongside race, gender,
is
etc.
is
odd, ODD,
is odd.
yeah. Yeah.
odd.
Saying that
Yeah.
most of these types of statements tend to list color separately from race. At best, that seems to acknowledge that skin color does not equal race, but it also, the questioner thinks it seems odd that that is listed alongside race, gender, et cetera.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to envision this form that has that listed, but at any rate, it brings up the oddity that we often use race in forms, in our engagements with each other, in scientific research, including biological and genomic research, without thinking about what it means. So for some people, as Dr. Tishkoff was saying in her talk, race is equated with color, when obviously that's just false. You can just look at people you think belong to a particular race, a group of them, and you see that they have different colors and may have the same color as someone in the other race. So that's patently just unrealistic. But what is the relationship in society between having a particular skin color and being treated a certain way, or being identified as having a race and being treated a certain way? Clearly, these are social categories, or I'd like to say political categories that are created to govern people that have a real impact on people's lives. So to me, whether it's odd or not depends on what is the purpose of this form. If the purpose, in my TED Talk, I refer to a genetic study where I was asked, check the box for your race, and it was colors. It was black, white, I guess they probably said Asian, Native American. But when I asked, why do you want to know this? Is it relevant to the study? Well, then maybe I should tell you about my ancestry. The person who gave me the form said, just check what you think you are. So clearly they hadn't thought very carefully about what the function of race was as a variable in their study. And this often is the case in lots of high-level scientific research. Race is used without a clear understanding of what it means. And so, yes, it becomes odd when it's just thrown out there without careful consideration of the purpose for which we are using these categories.
Can I say briefly?
Absolutely.
And there is also, and this may or may not be considered an offshoot from race and logics of racial reasoning, but globally, all kinds of investments in colorism too, right? So you don't have to be at an HBCU to know the brown paper bag test and to think about the ways in which people deploy color, even intraracially, to make this thing. So there are all these kind of offshoots of a sort of logic about reading the body to make social distinctions in the world. And sometimes it's within these ostensibly racial categories that are about, the hue of the particular racial subject.
Yeah, Spike Lee movies, right? This question is for Sarah, and then anyone else who would like to weigh in. There are a number of drug development, there's a lot of drug development research being conducted in Africa. This research has also been associated with ethical concerns pertaining to race, exploitation of the populations in developing countries, and how little these populations actually benefit from the research. Thinking from the point of common ancestry from Africa, can these researchers be justified, and what role does race play?
Well, that's a great question and a complex one. Yeah. So it is true that I'm not as familiar with this, but I know there are pharmaceutical companies who are doing things like testing drugs used to treat HIV, for example, in African populations. And I think that generally any study of this type, you have to be extraordinarily careful in terms of the ethical concerns. So this has been abused in the past, and I can't remember the exact circumstance. I remember this was like at least 5 years ago in Cameron, that I think that the subjects in that study had not been properly informed. And that caused a huge backlash, and I must say, I think it led to some changes in the African communities in terms of ethical review. So nowadays, I would say that there's very good, much better at least, training in terms of IRB ethical review of these proposed projects. So we have to make sure that it is clearly stated what the potential risks are, what the potential benefits are, if there are none, and then you have to weigh it just as we do here in the US. Now, in terms of the potential benefit, I would say that, part of the problem, my concern is that if we're not doing any research in ethnically diverse people of different ancestries, they may not benefit from the development of better therapeutics, particularly for diseases that are prevalent, say, in Africa. So certainly it has the potential to benefit, but that is something you have to be extraordinarily careful with. And certainly in my own research, we have to take a lot of time meeting with community members and explaining the project and explaining in layman's terms, what do we mean by genetics? What is this, why are we studying this? So I do worry that if they're not taking the proper time to communicate, that could be a problem. And I don't know what the other part of that was.
Relationship race, I think
The
it
relationship with race.
Yeah, and what
relationship
role
with
does race
race.
play? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, one aspect that can be harmful is where, and Sarah doesn't do this at all because she points out the genetic diversity within African populations, but sometimes when research is done in a particular group that is identified as a race, people believe, and the media sometimes portrays it this way, as if it is studying some unique biological aspect of this race that proves that race is a biological category. So I'm thinking, for example, of the New York Times journalist Nicholas Wade at the time reporting on research in Africa having to do with HIV and AIDS, and he reported that they were looking for the African gene for HIV. Well, that then reinforces this myth that there is such a thing as an African race that has some distinctive genomic trait that then produces HIV differently in this group of people, reinforcing not only the biological concept of race, but the idea that people of different races have different diseases and experience common diseases differently.
And that's absolutely true. And it's actually, in fact, one of the best known genes, that variants that plays a role in resistance to HIV is in European descent people predominantly. You'll see variation amongst different ethnic groups, different ancestries that could play a role in disease resistance. It's certainly not unique to any group. But at the same time, based on the evolutionary and demographic history that I presented to you, we do see differences. Sometimes in genes that play a role in drug metabolizing, sometimes in genes that play a role in disease risk, that together with environmental factors can influence risk for disease. So I think we have to at least be aware of that, but without the sort of racial profiling or stereotyping.
Yeah, that's my point. Mm-hmm.
So I'm watching the clock. I want to try to get one or two more questions in, but I will tell you, panelists, that I think the nature of the questions that we're getting, many of them are around race. They're around your work. And so I think the nature of the questions that we're getting really illustrates the beauty of knowledge and the teach-in, because we wanted to talk about knowledge and the importance of it and how to communicate it. But also, I think it just speaks to the hunger for knowledge and the fascination with the work that each of you do. So that said, that's kind of where our questions are going. And John, I'll direct this one to you. Given the amount of information present regarding the origins of the human species, is it possible that in the future there will be a destruction of the notion of race or the categorization of race that is present today, or is it too deeply ingrained in our social fabric to do so?
It's a great question. I mean, I think maybe part of what it speaks to is this aspiration we all have. We imagine for some world we can exist in that's quote unquote post-racial, right? We learn enough from the history of the bad behavior we've had under the auspices of racial reasoning that we get rid of it. I guess part of what I would argue is, part of our job is to remember the historical context that we come from and to recognize that our job, that part of, I think, the role of the academic is to say there are tons of different configurations we might have for how we distinguish us's from thems. Race has pretty good staying power, as it were. If I were a gambling person, I'd put my money on it being around for a while longer. But I do think we should also be mindful of the fact that the logics that we use to approach how we distinguish in hard and fast ways between different categories of persons on the planet, we actually deploy differently under other auspices linked to identificatory distinctions. So I think being able to recognize that, I think part of our goal shouldn't imagine this world where somehow we forget about race entirely, but to continue to learn from all of the stuff we do with race that we know we shouldn't be doing, and that makes all of our lives a little bit less just, fair, and humane, and that would be the key. And I think we can do that and still be cognizant of the history of racial identity, still recognize that these are cultural categories like all the other cultural categories. So what I would say, and this is the last point, is, we tend to think of these identities as though we can kind of take them off and put them on like clothes, or we can adjust them. If we don't like race, we can try a different race on for, sorry, this kind of voluntaristic thing. And I think the better analogy is peeling the layers off of an onion, whereas if you keep peeling, eventually the whole onion disappears. We only come in into ourselves kind of existentially through these categories, as flawed as they are, as cultural as they are. Without them, we would not exist in a way. And so we have to recognize that that's something we don't just escape or sidestep, but how do we be much more self-conscious about what we do with these categories, and to try to find spaces to feel like we have the agency to redesign them, at least in small ways. But it's not as though there's some other way to come into a sense of humanness except through these flawed and very non-biologically sound cultural categories we use. That's it. Now, I think the only issue with race is it seems to be one of the powerful ways in which we produce cultural categories and then pretend their cultural beginnings away. That's like the only difference. Some of the other categories we know are cultural. We can still do horrible things, right? But it's one of the versions of hard and strong culture that pretends not to be culture at all. And for anthropologists, we would say that's basically everything we do, right? We might call it religion in one context, but it's all the stuff of culture that then we want to pretend away its cultural beginnings. And our job is to just recognize, I think, one of the jobs of an anthropologist who does the work I do is to get people to come to terms with the fact that all this stuff can still be valuable and meaningful and important to you without having to be supernatural or biological. Right? And that actually something about that makes it even more quintessentially human to recognize its production out of our species in some sort of specific way.
It also gives hope for change, for social change. The fact that it's not rooted naturally within us. It's something that was invented, and therefore it can change. Difficult as it will be, but it's something we can work on changing to have a more humane and just world.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I'm going to do one last thing before we go to the reception. Our panelists will be there, so if you've got more questions, and we didn't get through all of them, they will be here if you've got some additional questions. But I would ask each of you 30 seconds or less to talk about the importance of this conversation. Why is it necessary for us to be having this conversation today around the importance of knowledge? And I'll let you answer that any way you want, but 30 seconds apiece. John, I'll start with you and we'll work our way.
So I will say maybe at heart, I think the question of what knowledge is, and this is to kind of remix some of what I think both Sarah and Dorothy had said, I think it's an ethical question. It's what do we value, what do we care about and believe in? And I think to understand that knowledge is guided by the answer to this kind of ethical imperative, I think is really important. And depending on what your ethics are, the knowledge you produce can be very different, and what you do with that knowledge can also be different.
Great.
Yeah, I'll keep mine really short because right now knowledge is being attacked. That's why we need to have this discussion. And what I really appreciate is the interdisciplinary perspective. So we see things from different ways, but they're complementary to each other. And I think that's really nice.
Yeah, I guess for me, it's that there is still far too much suffering and injustice in the world. And I believe we can use knowledge if we are critical of how we bring unjust assumptions to it. And we can be creative about designing research that can actually help to reduce it and create a better world. And that's why I think knowledge is important.
Okay. On that note, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our distinguished panel for sharing their insights with us. Special thanks to Dr. Venkatesh and to the Faculty Senate for putting all of this together. And as I mentioned, there is a reception upstairs. We'd love for you to join us. If you've got some additional questions or comments for our panelists, please feel free to join us. It's upstairs in the lounge. We'll look forward to seeing you there. Thanks again.